Welcome. I am Professor Theodore Ted Shaw of UNC Law School and the Director of the Center for Civil Rights. I welcome all of you today to this program. I want to say a few words by introduction. First, I want to thank Professors Delgado, Stefancic, and also Brian Gibbs, Professor Gibbs, for their participation in this program. And want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank April McKinley of the Center for Civil Rights for all that she's done to put this program together. I just want to say a word about the dedication of this program. We dedicate this program today to my dear friend and colleague. When I say my dear friend, I should say our dear friend and colleague, Lonnie Guinier, who was an extraordinary lawyer. We worked together at the Justice Department early in our careers in the Civil Rights Division. We worked together for many years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and remained colleagues and friends throughout the rest of her life. And she'll always be with me through the rest of my life. Lonnie was one of the leading, if not at one time, the leading voting rights lawyer in the country. When it came to the work that she did, she also was someone who was a mentor who brought along new generations of voting rights and civil rights lawyers. She taught after her litigating career at UPenn Law School, and then became the first Black woman on the faculty of Harvard Law School. And her academic career was just as extraordinary as her lawyering career. She wrote many books and articles that were ahead of her time. She was prescient in what she saw with respect to where we are as a country when it comes to voting rights, and she had fresh and new ideas. I love Lonnie dearly. I valued her as a colleague. She was taken from us too soon. She passed away last week, and we dedicate today's program to her. Lastly, I want to lift up one of the lawyers, or a lawyer, I should say, right now, maybe the lawyer, who is at the Center for Civil Rights. Erika, as you will hear, joined us fairly recently. Erika Richmond, who is a double graduate of HBCUs, came out of North Carolina Central Law School a couple of years ago and worked for Legal Aid of North Carolina, doing housing issues and disaster-stricken areas. And we were fortunate enough to land her. This is her brainchild, this event, but we've all been watching as the madness and the discourse about critical race theory has come out in the last few years and continues. So we wanted to talk about and have some of the experts talk about critical race theory and what it is and what it isn't. So that's our purpose here today. I also want to thank Charles Story of UNC Law School for making this event possible with his technical expertise. So critical race theory, Richard, you've been here in the beginning. Stephanie, you've been here. There you go. You've made a huge contribution to this work, and we look forward to hearing from you and from Brian. I've said enough. It's in your hands, Erika Richmond. Take us away.
All right, thank you, Professor Shaw. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your curiosity about critical race theory, also known as CRT. Because of all of the debate and misinformation surrounding this topic, we here at the UNC Center for Civil Rights wanted to gather experts to educate our community and members of our surrounding communities about what CRT is and isn't. We hope that you will find this discussion informative and that you will share what you've learned here with your friends and loved ones. Also, a recording of this discussion will be available on our website. So, like Professor Shaw said, my name is Erika Richmond. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here with the Center for Civil Rights, and I will be moderating this discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Richard Delgado, who is considered one of the co-founders of CRT. Professor Delgado is the John J. Sparkman Chair of Law at the University of Alabama School of Law. He has written numerous journal articles and books on race and the law, many of which were co-authored by his partner, Jean Stefancic, who is also joining us as a panelist. Jean Stefancic is professor and Clement Research Affiliate at the University of Alabama School of Law. She has taught courses on civil rights and race in the justice system. The books she has co-authored with Professor Delgado about CRT are amazing resources for anyone who would like to learn more about CRT. Our third panelist is Dr. Brian Gibbs, Clinical Assistant Professor here at UNC with our School of Education. Professor Gibbs studies the limits and possibilities of critical social studies in complex social and political contexts and its implications for teacher education. And last but not least, we have my mentor, Theodore Shaw. Professor Shaw is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law here at the UNC School of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights. Prior to joining the center, he was Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And now that we have introduced our panelists, let's begin our discussion. Each panelist will have, we've allotted between 5 and 8 minutes for each question. And so our first question is for Professor Delgado. Can you tell us about the origins of CRT?
Sure, glad to. If you read our book, which Erika just now boosted, thank you. You'll learn that critical race theory sprang up in the 1970s as a number of lawyers, activists, and legal scholars across the country realized more or less simultaneously that the heady advances of the civil rights era of the 60s had stalled, in many cases were being rolled back. Realizing that new approaches and strategies were necessary to combat the subtler forms of racism that were gaining ground, earlier writers such as Derek Bell put their minds to the task. Bell, as you may know, wrote a groundbreaking article on the strange coincidence that Brown versus Board of Education, that amazing breakthrough case, came down in 1954, just then, and not 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, or 50 years earlier. Other early writers wrote about hate speech, a topic close to my heart, or unconscious discrimination, as Charles Lawrence did in a groundbreaking article in Stanford Law Review, and many others as well. The trouble is that this was before the internet. We were all spread out throughout the country, one in this coast, the other in that coast, another here and there. And so we had a little group cohesion. We knew of each other through writings and occasional phone calls, but little else. That opportunity arrived in 1986 when the Conference on Critical Legal Studies, a white-dominated, left-leaning organization of professors at leading law schools under the leadership, so to speak, of Duncan Kennedy, conducted their annual meeting in Los Angeles at an old hotel. The young CRTers were impressed by CLS, which had a lot to teach us about class and economics of race and distribution in this country. But CLS lacked any coherent account of race and racism and the part that it played in subjugation of populations, subjugation of populations. So some of us wrote CLS asking for an opportunity to be heard, which they readily granted. So about 6 of us, some Latinos and some Blacks, conducted a teach-in for their benefit in the form of a panel on race, the first ever in CLS history. The Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review was good enough to publish the papers from that panel. So now we had a presence in the scholarly literature. Some years later, at Wisconsin, Kimberly Crenshaw held a second meeting at a convent outside of town, and it's quite a bit larger than the first one, since by now we had a bit of a reputation and some cohesion. We discussed common approaches and problems, and gave ourselves a name, a quite unfortunate one, in my opinion, critical race theory. I mean, who likes theories? We were interested in action and changing the world. Who likes critics? To the everyday mind, those sound like nags, people who go around nagging you, like your 3rd grade teacher when you were late with your homework. Well, we didn't want to nag white people and make them feel guilty, as our critics say about us. We wanted to make America better, with a better place for everybody. But the movement was then off and running.
Thank you, Professor Delgado. So my next question is for you, Professor Stefancic. Could you tell us about the basic ideas or tenets of CRT?
Okay. What do critical race theorists believe? Not every writer or teacher or theorist would agree, but many hold that 1, racism is ordinary, not aberrational. That is, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Ordinariness means that racism is difficult to address or cure because it is not acknowledged. For example, colorblind or formal conceptions of equality expressed in rules that exist only on treatment that is the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining or an immigration dragnet in a food processing plant that targets Latino workers. 2, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. This mechanism, sometimes called interest convergence or material determinism, adds a further dimension. Because racism advances the interests of both white elites in a material way and working class whites in a psychic way, large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate it. Consider, for example, Derek Bell's shocking proposal that the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, may have resulted more from the self-interest of whites in power than from a desire to help Blacks. Going on to number 3, the social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. Therefore, race is not objective, inherent, or fixed. It corresponds to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents or manipulates or retires when convenient. Number 4, another somewhat recent development concerns differential racialization and its consequences. Critical writers in law, as well as in social science, have drawn attention to the ways that dominant society racializes different minority groups at different times in response to shifting needs, such as the labor market. Consider the way in World War II, the Japanese agricultural workers were sent to war location camps,
Yeah.
relocation camps, detention camps, concentration camps, call them what you will, while society cultivated other groups of color for cannon fodder on the front. Closely related to differential racialization, the idea that each race has its own origins and ever-revolving history, is the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. That is, no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. A white feminist may also be Jewish or working class or a single mother. A Black activist could be male or female, gay or straight. A Latino may be a Democrat, a Republican, or even Black, perhaps because that person's family came from the Caribbean. And 6, consider the way the role of popular images and stereotypes of various minority groups shift over time. During slavery, Blacks were depicted as happy, simple-minded, and content to serve white folks. That made them all feel better, the white folks that did. Later, during Reconstruction in Jim Crow, in cartoons, movies, and other cultural scripts of the time, they appear as menacing, brutish, and out of control. They all serve their own purpose. Now, there are many more, and I'm not going to take up all the time to tell you about them, so I advise you, if you're interested, to read Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which Richard held up and he's holding up again. And you will find explanations of the rest of these tenets of critical race theory.
Thank you, Professor Stefanczyk, for giving us an overview of the tenets of CRT. My next question is a two-part question, and it's for Dr. Gibbs. Dr. Gibbs, what is the difference between CRT, which is taught largely in law school, and the culturally responsive curriculums that are used in some K-12 schools? Also, can you tell us about your research and data proving the benefits of racially inclusive curriculums?
Yeah, Erika, thank you so much for the question, and thanks so much for the introduction, Dr. Stefanczyk and Dr. Delgado. So CRT and how it sits in schools of education, it does. Like, it's Gloria Ladson-Billings, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Dr. William Tate, inspired by Derek Bell and other folks from critical legal studies that developed CRT. They migrated CRT into education and graduate schools of education as an analytic lens through which to conduct research. And so CRT is something which is taught in graduate schools of education at the master's analysis level and the PhD level, in which you are using it to analyze data and better understand the circumstances that schools have. But CRT is not something which is typically taught in schools of education for licensure, so in teacher preparation, because it's an analytic tool instead. But what is taught in teacher education programs, and I think what, in terms of schools and classrooms, when they say CRT, what they're really pushing back against is an anti-racist pedagogy. They're pushing back against an anti-oppressive pedagogy. They're pushing back against a liberatory pedagogy. They're pushing back against a generalized critical pedagogy, like the growth of what Freire and Jeff Duncan Andrade and many other folks have called like this growth of critical consciousness, making students aware of society, the space in which they exist, in ways in which to push back against that. But specifically, I think one of the things that in terms of race and ethnicity, in going back to Erika's question, Gloria Ladson-Billings, in her really germinal study the education of Black children, and through which she developed what we refer to as culturally relevant pedagogy. And just in terms of books, this is Dr. Ladson Billings' books, The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, in which what she did in her research is she studied 9 teachers that colleagues said, principals said, students said, parents said better educated their children who were Black children. And she found through that there were commonalities through which these teachers had in which they engaged in the education of Black children. One of the questions that she gets all the time is, can white teachers, or can teachers that are not from the cultural or ethnic group in which they're teaching, engage in culturally relevant pedagogy? And she says, yes. One of the teachers from her first study in the 90s was a white woman. But what happens in K through 12 classrooms in terms of culturally relevant pedagogy is this notion and this understanding that education and teaching does not happen in the vacuum, that students are from a community, they're from a culture, they're from a society. There's certain language patterns which happen at home. There are certain ways in which religion is talked about and discussed within the space. There are ways in which cultural mores are passed on. And so the idea of a culturally relevant pedagogy is that the teachers are aware of this, they understand it, they explore, they read, they gain knowledge, they listen to their students, and then they wrap that around the students in terms of their curriculum, meaning that life outside school becomes an important part of life inside school. And by making it part of life inside school, what that does is it elevates and raises it to a place where children of color, who are typically not seen in the mostly white, mostly middle-class curriculum in most schools and most school spaces, is elevated to a space of being worthy of contemplation and examination and learning and knowledge base within the schools and classrooms. What Gloria Ladson-Billings has argued is that culturally relevant pedagogy has 3 basic tenets. And one is this notion is that we want students to be academically successful. The second is we want students to grow cultural competence and cultural knowledge and love of themselves and love of their community that can happen within school. And third, we want to develop this notion of a critical consciousness, that we want students to understand that society was made and created, that things don't happen by accident, and that there are ways in which this came about as part of this. And so culturally relevant pedagogy can be everything from understanding and honoring student language patterns to art on the wall, which reflects the cultural mores and cultural heroes and folks within spaces, to having a more authentic and honest curriculum, which is more inclusive of stories of people of color through literature and art and the historical knowledge. And since her theory of culturally relevant pedagogy has happened, there's been growth and build up upon that. Chris Emden at Teachers College has come up with the notion of reality pedagogy, which is the idea that we need to come up with ways to help students teach us about their culture and their language and who they are as a way to engage it within the classroom. Django Paris and H. Sami Alim have come up with the idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy, which means that not only do we use students' home culture and ethnicity and race and power to help them succeed within this classroom space, that we actually are additive to them, that we're sustaining so they don't lose who they are, and we're adding to their understanding of their home culture, their home space, their ethnicity, etc. And then most recently, Bettina Love and her notion expanding upon the idea of an abolitionist education, which is being authentic and honest with children while at the same time making sure that we center joy and Black love through the teaching that students are gaining within that. And then just, I'm going to do a little twist on the second question, which is here in North Carolina, as CRT was making it across the United States, different state legislatures began to have anti-CRT legislation and laws. And here in North Carolina, our legislator jumped on the bandwagon and came up with what's called HB 324, which was the anti-CRT piece. And then we also had the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson developed what he called the FACTS, F period A period C period T period S period task force, which was a way in which folks could report back to him and to this task force commission, identifying teachers and educators that they thought were teaching critical race theory and pushing indoctrination. And so what my research was looking at was, I was curious about how was this impacting the way in which teachers were engaging in the work of using culturally relevant pedagogy and using culturally sustainable practices within their classrooms. And so I wanted to explore that. And one of the things that I found of the 22 teachers I've interviewed so far as part of this project, only 3 of them could really specifically talk about what CRT was, which was interesting. So we're getting all this pressure that teachers are teaching CRT, but they don't know it because it's not something, again, with it, which is in teacher education programs. The 3 teachers that could speak about it were graduate students that were learning as a theoretical lens for the research in which they were going to do and engage in. And so what I found was that the way some teachers reacted to this was that they laughed. They laughed at the legislation because of the ridiculousness of the language that was there. But they also saw the danger in it, in that neither one of these legislations have an enforcement mechanism. And so the teachers were reading it as a way in which to inspire people to push back and kind of have citizens, as opposed to like the state licensure board, push back and add ideological and political pressure on them not to teach about race and class and power, not to teach a more authentic history around these things. But what I found consistently amongst the teachers was this notion of a fear of this. But what I found also was a really heavy determination to come up with ways in which they were going to continue to teach it. The majority of them saw this local focus on CRT as part of the longer kind of right attack on education, which they've seen for quite some time. But this was the latest one. This was a more specific one. This was a more defined one within that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbs. Let me just ask you just a follow-up. Do these culturally responsive curriculums benefit both Black children of color and children of color and white children?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, multiple studies, study after study after study, have indicated that culturally relevant approaches which move beyond the white curriculum, the general typical curriculum, things that move beyond that are beneficial to both children of color and to white children as well. It raises awareness, it raises knowledge bases, it decenters the way in which we think about power and who's included within the space. Absolutely. Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So this next question is for anyone who wants to hop in and answer it. Is CRT racially divisive? And how can CRT be used as a tool for racial unity?
I'll take a shot at that. I'll begin by asking Brian a question. Brian, Erika's question that she put to you and asked you about data. And I wanted to ask you about some data that I have heard, anecdotal, well, not anecdotally, I've read about it from multiple sources, including Christine Sleater, that in Tucson Unified School District, a large urban school district with a heavy minority student body, they started teaching Mexican American studies, MAS, some years ago under a federal consent decree, the desegregation decree that required them to offer courses of that kind. To the astonishment of, I guess, everybody, that program, which was taught by young, dynamic professors, graduates of the University of Arizona's impressive ethnic studies department, that program started producing results that I've read were just sensational. The Latino kids who took the program, not every kid was Latino, but most of the enrollees were, before the institution of MAS had flunked out or dropped out of school at around a 50% rate. They found little use for education. They knew they were going to grow up to be farm workers or car mechanics, and the school wasn't doing much for them. But after they started learning about the great civilizations of the Mayas for example, that had running water way before Europe did. When they learned about the Aztec calendar, which was accurate to within a millisecond over a 1,000-year period, and far better than today's calendars. You have to throw them away and get a new one each year. Try to recycle yours if possible. They learned about Martin Luther King. They read about Cesar Chavez, who led farm workers strikes. They read about the civil rights movement. They read novels like Bless Me, Ultima, or The House on Mango Street. They actually read someone written by two members of this panel. They grew excited, and after a year or two, 90% of them I read were graduating, not 50%, and many going on to college. I actually heard about one who is now in law school. Brian, do the statistics bear out what I've described right now? Or this is just one school, one program, but is this true in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson Unified School District was, yeah, incredibly successful and incredibly powerful. I mean, not only were students much more likely to attend and continue school and graduate and then go on to post-secondary education, but they gained a cultural pride and cultural knowledge, as you said, that they understood that they were the inheritors of scientific discoveries and literature and literacy and all of these powerful things. Yeah, so the Mexican American Studies program is unique in that it became a program as opposed to a course, and so it was a program of choice that students within Tucson Unified School District could choose to engage in. So they would take U.S. history and English and chemistry. They would take all the typical courses, but they would take them through a lens of ethnic studies. They would take them through a lens of culturally supportive and sustaining pedagogies. And so the Tucson Unified School Districts, I mean, their research was through the roof. I mean, the documents, the data was through the roof in terms of how successful it was. Absolutely. There's a lot of other data, specifically like ethnic studies is one. We can think of it as ethnic studies has been around for quite some time, but it's also very much connected to a culturally sustaining, critical, culturally relative pedagogical framework, for sure. And there's much data on the success, particularly of students of color who have taken ethnic studies courses, in terms of motivation to stay in school, knowledge of self, engagement in in post-secondary education and involvement. Absolutely. As well as absolutely, yes.
Many of those kids I read changed their aspiration level. When they grew up, they devised plans to get law degrees and be lawyers, to be mayors of little towns, to be novelists like Anaya, whom they read, to be professors, to be teachers, if given a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
A chance to say something.
Did you want to say something, Professor Stefancic?
No.
So I wanted to make sure that we had enough time for this question. I know that Professor Delgado wanted to weigh in on it, and also Dr. Gibbs. Why do you think CRT has seen so much resistance, especially from the right?
For the first 40 years or so of critical race theory, it received very little resistance. I personally got either no or very few hate messages, emails, phone calls, and so on. We were sort of on a glide path. We wrote our articles, wrote our books, taught our classes, held our meetings. It was pretty smooth sailing. About a year and a half ago, things changed. We now have a rabid right-wing movement that wants to relabel critical race theory and get the public to associate it in their minds with everything it hates. Riot happens downtown. Oh, it's critical race theory. The economy drops. Your IRA is worth less now than it did last year. It's critical race theory. Where did this attack come from, and why is it happening right now? Derek Bell had some theories about the timing of things. I hereby offer this analysis of the latest right-wing attack on critical race theory that's been raging for about a year and a half. One contributor, I think, a simple disappointment in Trump's loss. Many of these people thought he was a shoo-in. Wherever they looked, there were signs on their neighbors' lawns saying Trump, Trump, Trump. Yet he lost. Something terrible must have happened. It must have been stolen. Critical race theory must have had something to do with it. They were looking for a scapegoat or boogeyman. What better thing than an academic framework like critical race theory? Number two is population change. The demography of this country, as everybody knows, has been changing. Right now in schools, in public schools, the population is already flipped. There are more minority school kids now than there are Caucasian ones. Some people find this disconcerting. I'm speaking of white nationalist people or people of that ilk. And they've devised a replacement idea that these other characters are going to replace us, which they believe is horrible. It'll destroy civilization, accomplishment, merit, and everything else that they like. Number three, excuse me, is, Dean, would you want to chime in? Well, that's probably enough for now. It's a question of timing and various forces that coincide at a given moment. It doesn't indicate that critical race theory is doing anything different than it has been doing all along, but people on the right are looking for someone to kick, and what better target than some inoffensive academics like Brian and Gene over here and me.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Shaw, do you want to add anything?
Well, once again, I want to thank our panelists. I wanted to underscore a couple of things that I think they've already made clear. We keep holding up this book, Critical Race Theory, and I encourage all who are with us virtually today to take a look at this book. And if you even do no more than go through and to the table of contents and look at the articles there, it's clear that critical race theory is the stuff of law schools, and legal academics wrote these articles. This is the movement that they've started. This has nothing to do with elementary and secondary school education, but it's a terrible mistake to conflate critical race theory, which is much more complex stuff. It's the stuff, as I say, of law schools, with inclusive elementary and secondary education. Yes, there are attempts to make elementary and secondary school curriculum and pedagogy more inclusive and less exclusive than historically it's been, but those are not the same things, and it's very important to recognize that. And frankly, this nonsense, I think about the governor of Virginia, the current governor of Virginia, who rode his way to office talking about critical race theory. That rhetoric is the stuff of white supremacy, frankly, and it's shameful that they engage in that kind of rhetoric, that kind of distortion. The notion is that law school education, I say this all the time to my students, has historically been both ahistorical and decontextualized. It ought to be historically inclusive and contextualized. That should not be a matter of controversy, but many times it is. I just wanted to underscore those differences and could say a whole lot more about it, but I'm grateful to you, Richard, to you, Jean, and to you, Brian, for your contributions today.
May I
Erika?
just like to contribute something here, listening to all the remarks, and I think Richard disliked the name critical race theory. I think it was very academic. It was something only an academic would think of.
Sort of a la-di-da.
But what happens, I think what happened with critical race theory happened with critical legal studies. Critical legal studies was really critical. It criticized laws indeterminacy and many capitalism, many other things, but it had no program. There's no program until people like Richard and Charles Lawrence and lots of other folks, I'm not going to try to remember them all, stepped in and said, hey, let's make room for problems of race. So that became, in a sense, a program for critical legal studies, but critical legal studies didn't want to take it on. So critical race theory developed, and it too did not have a program. It was theory. It was really theory. And then there were a few articles that said, well, we need to do something about redlining. We need to do something about stereotypes and so on. And people did write articles. But critical race theory remained a theory, and without a program, it was subject to interpretation by whoever wanted to say what it was. Thus, we have what we have today. We have an interpretation by the DEI folks. We have an interpretation by opponents. Thank goodness we have interpretation by the ed schools, which took on critical race theory, which now flourishes in schools of education, colleges of education, more so than it does in law schools. It'd be very lucky to find one course in every law school that teaches race from a critical perspective, but that's it. There's no practical application. There's one at the University of Alabama, which I will not go into or take too much time, where we teach young law students how to think about their careers as social justice advocates or social change advocates. So I think one of the problems today is that critical race theory is loose in the world, subject to interpretations by people who don't understand it, and that is partly the fault of critical race theory movement at the beginning. So that's my contribution.
Erika, I think we have a little more time. I just remembered the third component I started to mention before. I think a third reason for the rabid conservative Republican backlash against critical theory now, and not 10 years, 30 or 40 years ago, is simply the pandemic. With it, kids are spending a lot less time in schools because they're closed, and a lot more time at home doing their homework online and doing other things, meaning that they have much more contact with their parents than they did before the pandemic. And the parents are learning, some of them for the first time, I'm speaking of white parents now, suburban parents, what the kids think. And they're shocked. The parents may live their lives in associating with other similar people in their country club, which are white, in their church, and they're white. And they all think roughly the same way about things, about politics and about the world. But the kids are somewhat different. They've gone to school with many classmates of color. They've had courses like the ones Brian described. They may have teachers of color. And so they see the world in radically different ways. This might come out in a visit to grandma. The parents announce that we're going to visit grandma. The kid might say, "Oh, great, I love grandma. It'd be nice to see her. We're going to wear masks, I hope." And this could lead to a big argument that the parent has a different attitude about masking than the kids do. Kids believe in science and Dr. Fauci. Maybe on another occasion, the parent resolves to test the kids to see what God hath wrought. And it turns out that the kid actually has a favorable attitude toward Black Lives Matter and thinks it's awful what the police have been doing to Black men. The parents have a different attitude. What sticks out in their mind, about Black Lives Matter is that last year when their town had a march, some poor merchant had their window smashed and had to pay $600 for a replacement. The parents learned that the kids are easy with racial activism and racial causes, but the parents are not. Who can we blame? Who can we blame for this? Something must be going wrong. It must be in the schools. Brian, I think it's people like you. So I think that demographic change is one factor, the replacement idea. And then of course the pandemic is another.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Delgado. And I wanted to get you in, Dr. Gibbs, but unfortunately, we only had 50 minutes. And, we could talk on and on and on about this, but unfortunately, our time has run out. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us to learn more about CRT. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Professor Stefancic, Professor Delgado, Professor Shaw, Dr. Gibbs. Thank you so much for joining me and for lending us your expertise. Everyone, please visit our website to view a recording of our discussion. We will also have additional resources for anyone who wants to learn more. And we will also be answering more of our excellent audience questions. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.